Hello, my name is John Schneider. When I was a kid, I used to visit my Grandma Vi in the Jersey Bayshore area, and I'd take 8mm movies of my family and their friends. In fact, I was the family filmmaker. Today I live here, but traded my film camera for video, and recently shot this tugboat in the Shrewsbury River. Welcome to Jersey Bayshore country. Where is the Jersey Bayshore? Let's get oriented by starting with the big picture. It's somewhere in here, part of the universe, and definitely part of our world. But it's like no place I've ever experienced. And as soon as we land, I'll show you around. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Jersey Bayshore Country. I'm your host, John Schneider. You know, one of the things I enjoy best about producing stories for my weekly show is discovering stuff I never knew. And there really is a lot to discover in this part of the world, and I enjoy sharing this stuff with other people. There are so many stories yet to tell, like the fascinating story of Simon Lake. Now, where's Simon Lake, you ask? Well, it's a trick question, because Simon Lake is not a lake at all, but it's a person. It's also a drive in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. Simon Lake Drive, appropriately located right next to the water. So, who is Simon Lake? Well, he's a person who some historians credit with building the first practical submarine, and one that was made out of wood back in the late 1800s. Yeah, like wood from trees. And his story can be a little complicated because there are so many aspects to it. But we're going to concentrate on Simon Lake's connection to Jersey Bayshore country, and more specifically, his relationship to Atlantic Highlands, and the bodies of water which are near these two towns. Now, Simon Lake was born in New Jersey in 1866 in a town called Pleasantville. He was the son of Christopher Lake, whose father was one of the founders of Atlantic City and Ocean City, who built the first highway and bridge to Atlantic City. He came from a family of inventors and entrepreneurs. And when he was 9, he took apart his stepmother's sewing machine and put it back together. Who hasn't done that, right? When he was 10, he loved reading the stories of Jules Verne, especially 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I like that one myself. He said later that he had begun to dream of making voyages under the water as a result of reading it. In 1881, his family moved to Toms River, where he sailed a boat, drew plans for types of boats, and started working with tools. Now, young Simon went to high school at Toms River, and he also studied at Clinton Liberal Institute in Fort Plain, New York, and ultimately took a mechanical course at Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. In 1884, he told his father he was through with school. He was 17 at the time, and he joined his father's foundry and machine shop, later becoming his partner. And while he was there, he invented a number of devices, which were chiefly used by fishing and oyster vessels in the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays. Now, Simon Lake had always had a desire to build a submarine, just like the one in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And his plans for this vessel, called the Argonaut, finally came to fruition. He named it after the Argonaut sea creature, better known as the Portuguese man-o'-war, because you could navigate on the surface, on the seafloor, or anywhere in between. Lake's vessel included an airlock and an air pump, but he didn't really know anything about how pressure underwater could affect the human body or the mind. His tiny Argonaut, however, would really only dive in shallow depths in Toms River, so it really wouldn't be a problem. Ultimately, the Argonaut was supposed to be navigated successfully over the sea bottom and be able to gather objects through an open door at the bottom. Eventually, Lake did design his submarine and submitted those plans to the United States Navy in 1892, but he was rejected. Years went by and young Lake finally moved to Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, which during the late 1800s appealed to investors with its pleasant climate, waterways, incredible views, and rolling hills bordering on the Raritan Bay. It appeals to people today. In 1879, a surveyor was hired to design a system of roads and lots for a much more permanent community. It was then that the Atlantic Highlands Association was formed by some prominent members of the Methodist Church to develop this community more thoroughly. People were coming to Atlantic Highlands from New York City and the surrounding area, and they camped along the water in tent colonies. An outdoor amphitheater and an indoor auditorium were built, which were both used to entertain visitors at the camp meetings. In 1887, Atlantic Highlands was incorporated as a borough, and so major construction within the town generally occurred between the 1880s through the turn of the century. There were hotels and cottages and rooms for rent and beautiful homes and entertainment. A fantastic pier was constructed reaching far into the bay, and that was for the steamboats which started coming from New York City. This is a pier which would also be used during a demonstration that Simon Lake would make years later. A large number of churches took root in the 1880s, the Central Baptist, First Presbyterian, St. Paul's Baptist Church, St. Agnes Roman Catholic, and the First Methodist, of course. Reverend James E. Lake was the pastor of Atlantic Highlands First Methodist Church, and he was also an enthusiastic promoter of Atlantic Highlands. You know, a number of names from the 1890s are the same names living in Atlantic Highlands today, and even some of the businesses. President William McKinley was the president of the United States, and a guy by the name of Garrett Augustus Hobart was his vice president. And Hobart was born in Long Branch. I mean, he was right from the Jersey Shore, and he attended Rutgers College. So Simon Lake loved the entire area. It had everything he needed to build and test his submarines. Meanwhile, he continued to try to interest the U.S. government and investors in his submarine, but for some reason, it just didn't happen. They just weren't interested. Now, Simon's aunt and her husband, Mr. and Mrs. Summers T. Champion, who lived in Atlantic Highlands, listened to Simon's sad story with interest, and they agreed to put a little money into his scheme to build his boat, which he did. Finally, in 1894, he built an experimental submarine called the Argonaut Jr. The boat was only designed to submerge in shallow water, travel around the bottom, and to test the opening of a hatch in a pressurized compartment. Now, it was a bit smaller than his original submarine, which he had tested in Toms River. This one would be 14 feet long. So once it was built, he and his cousin decided to test their creation in the waters of Jersey Bayshore country. Simon Lake wrote about the test. He said, "We got her into the Shrewsbury River and paddled along the surface until we got to Blackfish Hole, where there was a depth of about 16 feet. That's what he said. Now, Blackfish Hole was located in the Navesink estuary near the Neptune Club, where the estuary flowed into Shrewsbury River. And the Neptune Club was on the property of Richard Hartshorn, which is today Hartshorn Woods Park. And this was located in Highlands, right across from Seabright on one side and Rumson on the other. And it seems to me this was an odd location to do the experiment because a newspaper article from 1885 reported a drowning accident there in which two sisters were swimming in a deep water area called Blackfish Hole. And the currents could be sometimes very treacherous there as the Navesink flowed into the Shrewsbury. So it's not clear why Lake would want to test the Argonaut here, but he did. Lake went on to say that when they got to the bottom of the river, they would run on the wooden wheels which were mounted on axles outside the frame. Now, two of these wheels were the driving wheels with a chain drive connected to a crank inside the boat. Third wheel at the stern was for support,
and steering. So this little thing would just, sink to the bottom of the river and then kind of move along like a car. It must have been strange. So when they got over Blackfish Hole, which was this deep area in the river, Simon told his cousin, Bart, to open the valve, and down they went. She sank beautifully, Lake explained in his memoirs, but when she got fully underwater, a half-inch stream of water spurted in through a bolt hole which they had forgotten to plug. The water hit Bart in the back of the neck as he stood at the controls, and Bart yelled, "Let's get out! Let's get out!" Simon remembered he thought he was going to die, and he plunged toward the little 6-inch glass-covered porthole. That was at the forward end of the boat, which had been put in to admit light into an otherwise dark interior. Lake asked him where he was going. He said he was going out the porthole, but of course that would have been slightly impossible. So they plugged the boat hole with a piece of pine and kept on going. Then they made their first underwater run with the Argonaut Jr, which ran across the river bottom and back to the pier by the Neptune Club, which is no longer there, of course, with no fuss at all, as Lake remembered. Lake said later that he and his cousin had a lot of fun with the little Argonaut for quite a while after that. They even ran around the bottom of New York Bay, he said, picking up clams and oysters, and they even speared fish through the doorway at the bottom. Lake was pretty happy with the results, but now he had his mind set on building a bigger boat. His uncle, Summers Champion in Atlantic Highlands, was one of the leading men of Atlantic Highlands at the time, a notable veteran of the Civil War, prominent businessman, and a warden of their church. His uncle suggested that before building a bigger boat, he should show everyone in the area what this one could do. So he arranged a public demonstration, and the mayor of Atlantic Highlands and the president of the bank and all the other people of prominence accepted invitations to attend. And so they did. They showed everyone what the Argonaut Jr could do, but unfortunately, a lot of people thought it was trickery when they brought up clamshells and old tin cans from the bottom. They thought it was all a ruse. So his uncle suggested a test to prove it was all real. He told everyone who was watching on the pier of Atlantic Highlands to write their names on a shingle and to tie a weight to it and throw it into the water. Then Simon would go out, submerge the craft, prowl around the bottom right there off Atlantic Highlands, and try to find it. If he succeeded, everyone would have to admit that his boat was real. And that's what they did. In no time at all, they found the list of names, rose to the surface, and waved the shingle triumphantly at everyone on the pier. After that, no one doubted the demonstration. It was real. Now, the newspapers of the day gave it plenty of space. Some carried full-page stories of the strange thing which came up the North Shrewsbury and now lies high and dry on Barley Point. Barley Point is a little island right in the Navesink estuary, right near where it empties into Shrewsbury River. And the New York Herald told this tale on January 8, 1895. But for the most part, the reporters seemed to hover between the aspects of, amusement and skepticism. Later, another demonstration was held in 20 feet of water for 4 hours at the bottom of the Patapsco River in Maryland, where it flowed into the Chesapeake Bay. This time, Lake invited a few guests to come along to experience the thrill. Can you imagine going on this thing? Volunteers who accompanied the inventor said they experienced no unpleasant sensation. The only time at which the motion of the vessel was felt, they said, was when rolling along the hard bottom. Then they said, there was a slight vibration. During their adventure, a diver on board entered an airtight compartment and made his way out of the vessel, and they were actually able to watch this guy as he moved about on the bottom of the river. They were looking through the porthole. And believe it or not, and this part sounds crazy, the diver brought back some fish, and a dinner was actually served underwater for the people who had come aboard as volunteers, just like being aboard the Nautilus in a Jules Verne adventure. Man, unbelievable. So Simon Lake had done it. And again, he tried to sell his idea for a submarine to the Navy, but to no avail. It was very frustrating for him. And before long, Lake was broke. He couldn't even pay his rent. And here's where Lake became somewhat frustrated by his competition, a man named John Philip Holland, who was an Irish engineer and who developed the first submarine to be formally commissioned by the United States Navy, and the first Royal Navy submarine called the Highlands. And this must have been very frustrating to Simon Lake. He was an American, and he had these great plans, very similar to Philip Holland, but the Navy said, no, we're going to go with John Philip Holland. This was probably the time when Simon Lake focused more on underwater science and exploration and not so much on military application. His success led to the formation of the Lake Submarine Company of New Jersey in 1895. Simon's Argonaut was built in 1897 in Baltimore at the Columbian Iron Works and Dry Dock to the dimensions of 36 feet in length with a 9-foot beam and powered by a 30-horsepower gasoline engine. In 1898, with a crew of 4 men, Simon Lake set out on a 2,000-mile journey in the Chesapeake Bay and on the Atlantic Ocean, traveling both on the surface and submerged and over all kinds of bottom surfaces. I mean, he really put the Argonaut to the test. And during the voyage, Simon Lake and his crew retrieved fish, clams, and oysters through the dive compartment in order to demonstrate the practicality of living and traveling underwater. I mean, this is back in the 1890s. It was the very first submarine to operate successfully in the open sea and at any desired depth and navigate on the ocean floor just like a car on land. And it would allow the diver to exit and enter through an open hatch. Now, during the test, it was also the first time an actual telephone message from a submerged submarine was received. Incidentally, 2 months later, the so-called first practical submarine, designed by his competitor, Holland, had submerged in Raritan Bay near Staten Island for 1 hour and 40 minutes. As a result of both of their successes, both Lake and Holland, the Argonaut was on the cover of the magazine Scientific American, but the USS Holland, shown here, was also in the same magazine in the same year. In 1901, Simon Lake created the Lake Torpedo Boat Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he built a number of submarines for the United States, as well as for foreign countries. Now, here's a postcard from the company at the time. It was here he built the Protector, a military submarine built for the United States and other foreign governments, believe it or not, including Russia, Austria, and Germany. We weren't at war with these countries at the time. Another submarine called the Defender was designed and built by Simon Lake in 1907. It could operate independently or in conjunction with a surface vessel or a mothership. One purpose was to demonstrate to the U.S. Navy the value of a diver's compartment with an exit hatch as a means of escape if the submarine were to sink, as well as for use in rescue missions on other sunken vessels. The submarine was also equipped with 3 torpedo tubes, 2 forward and 1 aft. That's forward and behind. At a later time, Simon designed a rescue attachment, which was a tube-like apparatus that connected from the diver's hatch to the outer hull of a sunken vessel. So the tube filled with compressed air, the work crew could cut through the hull of the sunken ship and provide an escape route for trapped sailors. With the escape hatch, the Defender could also be used for laying mines or cutting mine cables, and it came fully equipped with dive gear, tanks, tools, air hoses, welding lines, you name it. Simon also at this time began providing consultation services to other countries like Italy, Germany, England, Norway, and Sweden, and he actually maintained offices in Russia, Germany, Poland, Austria, and England. He also shared part of his London office with the Wright brothers, who were also forced to market their inventions abroad due to lack of interest by the U.S. government. Do you believe that? In 1907, he built his lifelong dream. He built a submarine called the Nautilus, named after the submarine in the Jules Verne novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
In 1912, he designed and built a submarine called SEAL, or G-1. It was the first of 33 submarines built for the United States Navy. The Explorer was the last sub built by Lake. The Explorer was a 22-foot, 10-ton sub. It was a two-man submarine that operated in conjunction with the mothership for electrical power and air. And here he is on the surface ship at the wheel. But the public didn't realize then how that little boat that he designed and manufactured, the Argonaut Jr, and all the submarines that followed, it would become the forerunner of the fleets of submarines which are now in every ocean. The Navy recognized his contributions by naming a ship after him. Finally, it was the USS Simon Lake, and it was the lead ship of its class of submarine tenders. It was decommissioned in 1999. While researching this segment on Simon Lake, I ran across another video report about some folks who actually tried to recreate Simon Lake's Argonaut, and here's part of their experiment.
He built Argonaut Jr. from 2 layers of pine boards that sandwiched canvas coated with tar for waterproofing, not epoxy laminated plywood. Neither epoxy nor plywood had been invented. He didn't have 3,000 psi scuba tanks for air. They hadn't been invented either. Instead, he bought a tank from a soda fountain that went out of business, and he pumped 100 psi of air into it with a hand pump used by plumbers. No acrylic viewports. Simon used glass portals from an old boat. And he sure didn't have a trolling motor and AGM batteries to push the Argonaut Jr. on the surface. Simon and Bart had paddles. The Argonaut submarine would use a gasoline engine to power the propeller and wheels, but the Argonaut Jr.'s wheels were powered by a hand crank. Electric motors and batteries existed in 1894, but they were very crude by today's standard. We used modern materials to build our version of the Argonaut Jr., but like Simon, we used the most commonly available and cheapest materials possible. Working weekends and most nights, it took us 8 months to complete our replica of the Argonaut Jr. But unlike Simon Lake, we have every modern tool at our disposal. We researched the original Argonaut Jr. using books from libraries and online sources. We also worked with over a dozen other submarine enthusiasts, historians, boat builders, and backyard engineers who helped with the history, design, CAD drawings, and even building the sub. Simon built his Argonaut Jr. with no electric power tools, no welder, no plasma cutter, and certainly no computer-controlled table to cut the wood or steel parts. The more we worked on building Argonaut Jr., the more impressed we became with what Simon and Bart were able to achieve. We know firsthand that getting a 6.5-ton submarine built and launched is no small task. But like Simon's, our Argonaut Jr. was also the first submarine we ever built or dove. And no matter how much you plan, diving a submarine will always come with problems and surprises, like leaks, jammed anchor winches and lost anchors, and even an explosion from overpressurizing a ballast tank. You don't have to climb Mount Everest to have an adventure. We'll never forget the feeling of slipping under the surface inside our wooden submarine, rolling along the bottom, having friends join us through the open diver's hatch, trying out a replica of Simon Lake's dive helmet, or the sight of sunlight and waves on the conning tower as we surfaced. Building the replica of the Argonaut Jr. was much more than just reading a book. It was learning the lessons and living the history.
So that is the story of Simon Lake and his connection to our part of the world, and I really hope you enjoyed it. And there are a number of books on Simon Lake, some of which he wrote himself, like The Submarine in War and Peace. I think it's interesting to note that Jules Verne, the author, in 1898, cabled to a New York publication to comment on Simon Lake's accomplishments, stating, quote, "While my book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, is entirely a work of imagination, my conviction is that all I said in it will come to pass. A 1,000-mile voyage in the Baltimore submarine boat, the Argonaut, is evidence of this." And Jules Verne went on to say, "The next war may be largely a contest between submarine boats. Before the United States gains her full development, she is likely to have mighty navies in the upper air and beneath the waters of the surface. That's what Jules Verne said back in 1898. You know, Lake's career in developing submarines spanned more than 50 years, from the 1880s until his passing in 1945. Ultimately, Simon Lake is credited with the development of the basic submarine technologies which led to the successful operation of submarines. I mean, things like even keel hydroplanes, which helps a submarine maintain its balance, ballast tanks, a diver's compartment, the periscope, the twin hull design in case there's a break in the outer hull, the inner hull will protect it, and so much more. No modern submarine today could operate without using these advancements that were made by Simon Lake and were developed and adopted worldwide by the 1900s. You know, at one time, Simon Lake employed nearly 5,000 people, an estimated 10,000 people worldwide during his lifetime. In the United States, get this, he had offices in Milford and Bridgeport, Connecticut, Norfolk, Baltimore, Ocean City, California, and New York. Simon Lake has been honored for his achievements in so many ways. A postage stamp with his image on it. He's got relics at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. There are newspaper articles. He's received awards, and there are monuments all over the place. But by the end of his life, he will be remembered as the father of the submarine. So that's the story of Simon Lake and his connection to Jersey Bay Shore Country and today's modern submarine. That's it for me. I'm John Schneider, Jersey Bay Shore Country. I hope you join me next week for a brand new episode. And remember, if you see me out there, maybe I'll be in a submarine, or I'm flying a drone, or I'm walking along, or riding a bicycle, or shooting my camera at something, please do stop, interrupt me, and say hello, because nothing is more important than meeting you. Bye-bye, everybody. See ya.